It's happening again. Justice Sotomayor slams the Trump administration and the conservative justice on the Supreme Court for rewarding lawlessness. This time, it's in the context of the Trump administration's attempts to unlawfully and illegally dismantle the Department of Education and fire federal employees that they don't have authority to fire. I'm Shant Karnikian. That's Brian Kabateck. We're two partners at Kabateck LLP. This is Civil Action on the Legal AF Network. Brian, tell us more about this case and what just happened with the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you, Shant. So this is definitely Justice Sotomayor drawing a line and slamming, as you said, the Trump administration and her other justices, the other 6 justices on the United States Supreme Court. So what's the background here very quickly so folks understand exactly what happened? And I'm just going to go through my notes. In March of 2025, Trump, I was going to say the executive department, but let's call it what it is. Trump decided that he was going to disband the Department of Education and came up with a plan under his highly qualified Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, right? And Linda McMahon's background, Shant, just for everybody?
Was involved in running a wrestling organization, WWE.
Yeah. Which makes her, inherently qualified to run the Department of Education.
Perfect.
The goal, the short-term goal was to eliminate about 1,400 employees from the department, which they did. Immediately, school districts in Massachusetts, as well as over 20 attorney generals across the United States, filed a lawsuit. It ended up in federal court in Boston. That court issued a preliminary injunction saying you can't fire these people. That went up to the Court of Appeals, the intermediary court, the Federal Court of Appeals, which upheld the injunction. And 2 days later, the Trump administration filed an appeal before the United States Supreme Court. And on July 14th, the United States Supreme Court came down and said, no, we're not going to enforce that stay order, that injunction. We're going to allow Trump to do what he wants to do.
Yeah.
Right.
They lifted it. And now I think the phrase that I found very powerful in Justice Sotomayor's dissent to the other justices' opinion was rewarding lawlessness. By doing this, they're allowing for lawlessness. And this isn't necessarily so much about the merits. There are major problems with dismantling the Department of Education, major policy concerns that I think cross party lines. But let's put that aside for a second. Just allowing this to move forward, allowing these cuts to happen without addressing the merits of whether or not they should, I think is a major problem. And as Justice Sotomayor says, this rewards lawlessness. It lets the executive branch, or Trump, as you pointed out, it lets Trump do whatever he wants, and she's taking a hardline position. She's drawing a line in the sand and saying, no, you can't do this. This is lawlessness. We can't have this.
And she doesn't just slam her own justices, she slams Trump. Yeah. And there's a couple of great quotes here. First of all, she says, the executive branch, which is Trump, has announced its intention to flout the law, and this court now joins in the effort to shield that defiance from accountability. So that's one. And then she says, when the president openly declares his intent to ignore the law, it's the judiciary's solemn duty to say no and not pave the way for lawlessness. So she calls him out. She calls out her own justices. And I want to make one thing very clear here, though, about this, is that this is not a final ruling, right?
It's not. No, this is just, it's a temporary issue. And the question is whether or not right now the injunctions issued can stand. The injunctions issued by the lowest courts here can stand. And the Supreme Court said no, but this isn't a ruling. This isn't a decision on what we call a decision on the merits as to whether or not Trump can just on a whim decide to dismantle the Department of Education. It's not a final ruling. And I bet you the right is touting this as a big win, and it's a win for justice, and they're making the government more efficient, and states' rights and all that nonsense. And we know that's the opposites. They're eroding states' rights. They're eroding democracy. They're harming people.
Well, let's talk about some of the real world effects of this. First of all, student loans. So student loans have been a big issue that I've been interested in because we work with young lawyers who have taken out tremendous amounts of student loans to make themselves, put themselves through law school and to become lawyers. And oftentimes we have people $200,000-$300,000 in student loans. Well, apparently now there's very few people to answer questions. The Trump administration has put a number of people into default, which forever affects their records. And there's nobody at the Department of Education to help them. They've transferred this to the Small Business Administration, which doesn't have the staffing. The Department of Education also deals with important issues involving discrimination. They don't have the staffing. And of course, that's the entire goal here. But turning back to this case, why this is important is because Congress enacted laws to create the Department of Education and to fund it. Those are two very different issues. You can create a room, but then separate laws must exist to put people in that room. And that's what Congress did. And what the Trump administration's done, and what these people have done, is they've said, we're going to fire the people. So it's kind of like a tricky little way. We're not going to eliminate the funding. We're just going to fire all these people. Well, and what Justice Sotomayor says is you can't do that. There's a balance here, a separation of power in the government, which clearly the Trump administration doesn't want.
Yeah, I think Justice Sotomayor highlights, and I fully agree with this. This is another part that really resonated with me, that this undermines the requirement that the president effectuate his constitutional duties. That the oath that he took is to carry out the laws that are passed by Congress. He is the executive. He carries out, he enforces the laws, or he's supposed to at least. He's not there to just get rid of laws or create laws with stroke of a pen. That's not what he does. Sure, there's executive orders, but this is a department that was created and funded, as you said, by Congress. And until Congress does something to repeal that or change it or modify it in some way, he needs to carry that out. He has a duty under the law to effectuate the laws that are passed by the legislature in the country, by Congress. And by doing this, he is violating that. And this ruling, the majority's ruling here, allows him to do that. It allows Trump, the executive, to breach his constitutional duty. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems here. It's a constant theme. And we need people like Justice Sotomayor to stand up and smack them down and bring them back down to earth and say, that's not how democracy works. That's not what our Constitution says. And I think she does a great job of doing that here.
Give you my final thoughts on this. First of all, this is not over. The case was sent back to the Court of Appeals for further proceedings on the merits and to establish a record. And presumably it will ultimately end up before the Supreme Court. Ultimately, what we have to see here is the profiles encouraged by other justices of the Supreme Court to stand up against this kind of tyranny. It is constantly the duty of people like Justice Sotomayor and, frankly, all of us to stand up against this and say this is wrong. The president is obligated to follow the law. He's not above the law. He thinks he's above the law. And I predict that as we go down this road, we're going to see some more erosion. We're going to see more dissents by Justice Sotomayor calling out Trump, but we're going to see more erosion at the same time of the executive and of Trump's ability to simply do what he wants. So, Sean, as usual, you get the last one.
Yeah, the rule of law here is, I think, the central focus. And I think a dissent like this, a dissent like Justice Sotomayor's, it does a great job of underscoring the importance and the role that the judiciary has in enforcing the rule of law and upholding one of the most fundamental components of democracy, of our government, of our country here. And I think while the majority here disagreed with her, I think dissents like this are going to be something that down the road, in decades and maybe even centuries to come, we look back on in law school or when we're trying to learn about the significance of rule of law. And this is a great piece explaining why it's important to have the courts do what they're supposed to do, why it's important to have an executive that follows the law, to have a president that executes what he's supposed to do, the laws passed by the legislature. And I think it does a great job of explaining that, laying that all out. And just because this is a loss at some phase, it's not the end of the road. Again, this isn't final. This isn't permanent. And as you said, this isn't done. I think it does a great job of explaining that. And I think that's very important. I think it's a worthwhile read. I'm glad and proud that she's standing up to all of this nonsense and setting the record straight, because I think in the long run, the big picture, things like this are going to illustrate to us why it's important. And it's a lesson that we can all learn about the importance of the rule of law and being careful about having dictators like this be able to come into power and undermine our democracy. I have hope that democracy will be saved by heroes like this. I'm Shant Karnikian. That's Brian Kabateck. This is Civil Action on Legal AF. Thanks for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. Share your comments. We'd love to hear your feedback. Follow us on socials, and we'll see you next time.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.